One of the choices you can make in Baldur's Gate 3 is to choose whether or not you play one of two types of Drow, a so-called Lolth-Sworn Drow or a Seldarine Drow. There might be some people that blithely make the choice of Lolth-Sworn Drow, but do they really know what that choice entails, and just how absolutely and thoroughly evil she is? Lolth is, strangely enough, one of the more popular deities, at least in terms of familiarity when it comes to D&D, as many people have heard of Lolth the Spider Queen, but very few people know just how horrific a goddess she is, what she is like, and what she does. Sure, the Forgotten Realms are filled with many evil deities, Bane, Loviator, Shar, to name a few, but few deities can rival Lolth in terms of the sheer chaos and malice she embodies, and the near insanity she instills in her followers and worshippers, driving them to states of monstrous frenzy. For those unfamiliar with her greater story, then it might come as a surprise that Lolth was in fact a cherished member of the Seldarine, or Elven Pantheon, and not just cherished, but also the wife of Corellin the Rhethian, the creator of the Elves, and was even the mother of his two children, Eilistrae and Varon. At this time, long ago, she bore the name Arushnae, and was the lesser elven goddess of destiny and artisans, as well as the patron of dark elves. We do not know how long she remained in this position, or more importantly, how sincere her commitment to it was, as all the legends tell us is what came after. Arushnae was dissatisfied with her position as mere consort to Corellin and lesser goddess, and wanted more, and so set about to ensure the fall of her husband and bring about her own ascension to power. Her very first attempt at ridding herself of her husband manifested itself as her secretly aiding the York god Grumsh in trying to slay Corellin, by magically altering the scabbard of his sword to shatter the sword when it was drawn, hoping that this would leave him vulnerable to the York god. But her involvement had been scrutinized by another prominent elven goddess, Sehanine Moonbow, who had observed her from afar when casting the magic. Corellin was indeed wounded, but managed to escape, despite her encouraging Malar, the Beast Lord, to attack the god. But Arushnae was not going to leave it at only one attempt, and planned something far greater and deadlier than before. Her next plan lay in gathering a host of gods into an army, gods hostile to the Seldarine, seeking to unleash this host upon her fellow gods. However, she knew that this would likely fail, as the forces she wished to gather were both insufficiently competent and poorly organized. But she was banking on something else. All was going according to plan, until Sehanine accused Arushnae of treachery, but with the aid of her son, who sought to help his mother, she imprisoned her so she could not warn Corellin. The army of gods she had gathered, however, was just a front for her true plan, which involved further enchanting the already cursed scabbard and giving it back to her husband, in the hopes that she might frame her daughter Eilistrae for his death. For the scabbard had been so enchanted that when his daughter shot her arrows to defend her father, they would magically be drawn to his chest, killing him and ensuring that Eilistrae received blame for his death, and shielding Arushnae in the process. Eilistrae delivered the scabbard to her father on the eve of battle, unwittingly aiding Arushnae in her coup. Things almost went as planned. Corellin was being attacked by multiple gods, and one charged him, and so Eilistrae fired her arrows to save her father. But instead of finding their intended target, they instead pierced Corellin's chest, and Corellin fell, nearly dying. Despite this, the other elven gods were able to rally themselves and succeed in driving off the assailing gods. Arushnae then surreptitiously sought to finish off her husband with poison her daughter had used on her hunts, but this ultimately failed, as Sehanine broke free from her prison and joined with two other elven goddesses, Airdrie Fenia and Hanali Selani, to become the triune goddess for the first time, known as Angarod, and using their combined might, healed Corellin and saved him from near certain death. In the wake of this, a trial was held, and Arushnae and her children, Varon and Eilistrae, were found guilty of conspiracy to murder, and exiled. Though Corellin's daughter, who was unwitting in her participation, was forgiven, and she was allowed to stay, despite ultimately choosing exile for the sake of the Dark Elves, who she thought would need a beacon of hope in the future. Arushnae was stripped of her divinity and turned into a Tanari, a demon, and banished from Arvandor, the home of the elven gods, for all time. Unaccepting of this, she transformed into a monstrous spider and attacked Corellin. But Corellin, still bound and blinded by his love for her, could not end her, and thus allowed her to escape. Having survived and licking her wounds, Arushnae gave up this name and instead took the name Lolth, She journeyed to the only place in the universe that she found suitable, the Abyss, the plane of absolute chaos and evil, and although no longer a goddess, was still very powerful, and she conquered the 66th layer of the Abyss. Other powers opposed her, but she overcame them all through deception, cunning, and outright strength, and she quickly set herself to the task of increasing her power base, with a long-term goal of exacting vengeance on her former husband. But being much weaker than Corellin, Lolth realized that the best way to get back at him was to hurt him indirectly by manipulating and harming his children, the Elves. Long ago, in pre-ancient times, an elf called Kethralia Amaryllis sought her lover in the Abyss, as he had been dragged into it via a portal by a demon. Having to travel through the demon web pits, the name of Lolth's lair and Lolth's realm, Lolth became aware of the world of Toril, and sensed its potential as a power base for worship and regaining her divinity. As she quickly took note that her son, Varon, had already gained a foothold in a realm called Ilithir, a realm dominated by dark elves. Lolth observed the ambition and brutality of the Ilithiri, and, admiring it, sought a way to attract their worship. She hatched a plan that would take millennia to come to fruition, but was ultimately responsible for the downfall of the Dark Elves. Lolth observed one archmage and leader of the Ilithiri in particular, one named Karnalist, a fierce and cruel man, and seduced him to her worship, and even temporarily took him as her consort. And over the subsequent centuries, Lolth succeeded in poisoning the Ilithiri beyond their own natural ruthlessness, and over time, reacquired her divinity, leading the Dark Elves ever further down the path of corruption. And corrupt them she did. During the Crown Wars, a series of wars that would splinter and forever change the elven landscape of Faerun, the Ilithiri began to openly court with demons, summoning the powerful Baldur Wendunai, a servant of Lolth, who further tainted the Dark Elves and brought them nigh fully under her control. More time passed, and Lolth, through her servant, and her own machinations, succeeded in bringing many more Dark Elves under her sway, so much so that the other elves, beleaguered and at their limit, prayed to their gods to curse the Dark Elves for their evil and corruption, which resulted in the final banishment of the Dark Elves from the surface to the Underdark, and the rebranding of the Dark Elves as Drow, an event that could be laid at the feet of none other than Lolth herself, as was her desire, as she ultimately sought to both accumulate power, but above all to bring low the Seldarine and their children, the Elves. By corrupting the Dark Elves and forcing them by way of the Elven God's intervention to be cursed, to forevermore be Drow, Lolth, at least in part, achieved her goal of harming Corellin and his children, creating a wound and rift that is not healed to this day, and likely never will. I realize I may not have as yet painted a sufficiently accurate picture of just how bad Lolth is, as this has been just a brief history, and what is a little bit of corruption and betrayal after all. But Lolth might actually possibly be the worst and cruelest deity in all of Faerun, and on some accounts, insane. Lolth revels in mayhem, cruelty, death, and wanton destruction, not only enjoying these things, but thriving on them, as they ultimately make her stronger. She delights in causing suffering, both personally and through manipulation, and her malice and evil run so deep that at times they exceed the expectations of those already familiar with it, invariably surprising those familiar with ever greater depths of depravity. And perhaps worst of all is the fact that Lolth is only consistent in her capriciousness and unpredictability, thus making it impossible to know beforehand what her intentions are, other than that they will be horrific and malevolent. Lolth is in this sense, despite not being native to the plane, truly a creature of the Abyss, as chaotic and evil as they come, and as any demon inhabiting it, and perhaps in some respects even more so. Lolth maintains an iron grip on Drow society, and her whims and desires determine virtually all aspects of Drow civilization, and that which she cannot control, whether directly or through her priesthood, is utterly destroyed, as she recognizes only two states for other sentient beings: service to her capricious whim or destruction. As a reflection of her view of the universe, and also partly to spite her former husband, Lolth has established an absolute matriarchy among the Drow, and Drow society is dominated by the priesthood of Lolth, and males wield very little power and influence, and survive by the whims of the priesthood of Lolth, and by ingratiating themselves to powerful females. To quote the famous rebel Drow and ranger Drist, who escaped the cruelty of Lolth's web, to illustrate the point, station is the way of Lolth, the ambition she bestows to further the chaos, to keep her Drow children along their appointed course of self-improvement. Children? Pawns, more likely. Dancing dolls for the Spider Queen, puppets of the imperceptible but impervious strands of her web. All climb the Spider Queen's ladders, all hunt for her pleasure, and all fall to the hunters of her pleasure. And few know and understand the cruelty of the Spider Queen as well as Rist, who was subject to it from his very first day of life, and until he left the city of his birth, Menzoberranzan, and even beyond, as the vengeance of Lolth is never-ending. For refusing to kill an elf child, his House Do'Urden, lost the favor of Lolth, which could only be regained by sacrificing his father Zaknafein, who was ritually murdered and raised as an undead creature, a Zinkarla, or spirit wraith, under the control of Drist's own mother, a priestess of Lolth, sent to kill her own son for daring not to murder a child. And this is all standard fare and protocol under the rulership of Lolth. Whereas an evil deity such as Bane might very well be a tyrant and demand absolute obedience, his lawful nature ensures both progression and stability within a hierarchy. An evil deity such as Bane is reliable, but within Lolth's web it is just an illusion, for no one retains the favor of the Spider Queen for long, and all eventually fall from her graces. As such, despite its chaotic nature, Drow society is unusually stagnant under the domination of Lolth, who continues to spin her web and weave grand plans, stringing all along she can manipulate as pawns, and destroying those she cannot. And I say all this to point out how truly and incomprehensibly awful Lolth is, to the point where, no matter how evil you might be, no amount of service to her cause would ever spare you her wrath, and you are guaranteed to lose her favor. It's not a question of if, but when. It is her nature to betray all but herself, and that includes all who worship her, indeed, above all, those who worship her. And those who follow her are just shooting themselves in the foot, and assuredly suffer far worse than mere failure. Of course, this is just my opinion, but I, for one, could never, ever follow Lolth, even when playing an evil character, simply because she is so depraved and so fickle that no reward other than my ultimate failure, or worse, would be guaranteed. But would you take the chance and choose to follow such an utterly malevolent, capricious, and possibly insane deity, even as you know what her nature is and what awaits you? In this sense, I have to say in the context of Baldur's Gate 3, even if I chose to play an evil drow, I would invariably play a so-called Seldarine drow, because at the very least, in this manner, I'm not guaranteed to be destroyed. As always, thank you for tuning in. Please leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, as it really helps out the channel, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.